What the hell is going on here? His voice boomed through the room, sharp and accusatory. I froze, the glass of wine halfway to my lips, my nephew's words still hanging in the air like a thick fog. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. I turned slowly, my eyes meeting my husband's. His face was a mask of confusion and anger, his gaze flickering between me and my nephew, who sat across from me at the kitchen table. The tension in the room was palpable, suffocating. Nothing, I stammered, my voice trembling. We were just talking. Talking? He repeated, his tone incredulous. He stepped further into the room, his eyes narrowing. It didn't sound like just talking to me. My nephew, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found his voice. Uncle, it's not what it sounds like. Get out. My husband interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. He pointed to the door, his hand shaking with barely contained rage. Now. The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, no one moved. My nephew looked at me, his eyes pleading, but I couldn't find the words to defend him. I was too shocked, too horrified by the situation unfolding before me. Slowly, he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and without another word, he walked out of the room. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, leaving silence in its wake. I turned back to my husband, my mind racing. Let me explain, I began, but he cut me off. Explain? He said, his voice rising. Explain what? What the hell were you two doing? What was he saying to you? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We were just talking, I repeated, though even to my own ears, it sounded weak. He's been studying here in the city, and he's been staying with us. We were catching up. Catching up? He scoffed. That didn't sound like catching up. It sounded like something else entirely. I felt a pang of guilt, but also frustration. You're overreacting, I said, my voice firmer now. He's just a kid. He didn't mean anything by it. A kid? He shot back. He's not a kid, and you know it. He's a grown man, and he had no business saying those things to you. And you should have shut it down immediately. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. He was right, and I knew it. I should have shut it down, but I hadn't, and now, everything was falling apart. It had started innocently enough. My nephew, Alex, had been staying with us for the past few months while he studied at the university in the city. He was a bright, driven young man, and I had been happy to help him out. He was family, after all, but over time, I had started to notice something different in the way he looked at me. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance here, a barely there smile there. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. That night, after dinner, we had been sitting at the kitchen table, sharing a bottle of wine. The conversation had been light, casual, until it wasn't. He had been quiet for a while, staring into his glass, and then, out of nowhere, he looked up at me and said, "Auntie, I need to tell you something." I had laughed it off, trying to keep the mood light. "What is it, Alex? You're not failing your classes, are you?" He shook his head, his expression serious. "No, it's not that. It's you." I blinked, caught off guard. "Me? What about me?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I know this is going to sound crazy, and I don't want to make things weird between us, but I like you, more than just family. I like you, and your body. I can't stop thinking about you." The room seemed to spin around me. I stared at him, my mind reelings trying to process what he had just said. "Alex," I began, my voice shaking, You can't say things like that. We're family. I know, he said quickly, his eyes pleading, and I didn't mean to say it. It's been eating me up inside, and I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I'm sorry, Auntie. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, the sound of the front door opening startled us both, and then, everything had spiraled out of control. Now, standing in the kitchen with my husband, I felt the weight of my silence pressing down on me. I should have said something, anything, to diffuse the situation, but I hadn't, and now, the consequences were staring me in the face. You should have told me, he said, his voice breaking through my thoughts. You should have told me the moment you noticed something off. I didn't think it was a big deal, I said weakly, though I knew it was a lie. It had been a big deal, I just hadn't wanted to admit it. Not a big deal? He repeated, his voice rising again. Are you serious? He's my nephew, our nephew, and he's been staying under our roof, looking at you like that, and you didn't think it was a big deal? I flinched at the accusation in his voice. I didn't know how to handle it, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. Well, it didn't go away, he said harshly, and now, it's a mess, a fucking mess. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't let myself fall apart. Not now. What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice trembling. What do you want me to say? He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched, his eyes searching mine. Then, finally, he sighed, and some of the tension seemed to leave his body. I don't know, he said quietly. I don't know what to do, but you need to fix this. You need to make it right. How? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. How do I make it right? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there alone, the weight of my choices heavy on my shoulders. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, before finally sinking into a chair at the table. The wine bottle was still there, half empty. I reached for it, my hand shaking, and poured myself another glass. What had I done? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? The silence of the house pressed in on me, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards as my husband moved around upstairs. I stared at the wine in my glass, the deep red liquid swirling as I turned it in my hand. I felt lost, adrift, unsure of how to navigate the storm I had created. And then, a knock at the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who could that be? Slowly, I set the glass down and I stared at the door, my breath caught in my throat. The knock came again, sharper this time, snapping me out of my frozen state. Who could it be at this hour? My husband was upstairs, his footsteps pacing back and forth like a caged animal, the tension between us still thick in the air. I didn't think I could handle another confrontation, but the knock demanded an answer. Slowly, I stood, my legs trembling slightly as I made my way to the door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment before I turned it, opening it just enough to see who was on the other side. Mrs. Johnson? The voice was familiar, and I blinked in surprise as I recognized Mrs. Harper, our neighbor from across the street. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with something akin to panic. She clutched a small package in her hands, her knuckles white from the grip. Mrs. Harper, I said, my voice cracking slightly. Why is she here? Is everything all right? She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was watching, before turning back to me. I'm so sorry to bother you so late, she said hurriedly, but I found this on my porch. and I think it might be yours. I didn't want to leave it out there overnight. It looked important. She held out the package, and I took it hesitantly. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with no address or label. What is this? Thank you, I said, my voice still unsteady. I'm not sure what it is, but I'll take a look. Mrs. Harper nodded, but she didn't leave right away. She shifted uncomfortably on the doorstep, her eyes darting past me into the house. Does she sense something? The tension in the air was palpable, and I wondered if she could feel it too. Is everything okay? She asked gently, her voice laced with concern. I heard some raised voices earlier. I just wanted to make sure everything's all right. I felt a stab of guilt at her words. Of course she heard. The argument between my husband and me had been loud, unrestrained, and I was sure it had carried through the thin walls of our house. I forced a smile, though it felt brittle on my lips. Everything's fine, I lied, my voice too bright, too cheerful, just a bit of a misunderstanding. It's been a long day. Mrs. Harper didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. Well, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. It's good to have neighbors who look out for each other. Thank you, I said, my voice softer this time. Maybe I should tell her. Maybe she could help. But the thought was fleeting, and before I could say anything more, she gave me a small wave and turned to leave. I closed the door quietly, leaning against it for a moment as I tried to steady my breathing. The small package felt heavy in my hands, though it was light as a feather. What could it be? I turned it over, my fingers tracing the edges of the wrapping, before I carefully peeled it open. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper, and a small, silver key. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the hastily scrawled handwriting. Auntie, it read, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I couldn't keep it in any longer. Meet me at the old place tomorrow at noon. There's something I need to tell you, and to show you, _. The words swam before my eyes, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. What is he thinking? My nephew, my sister's son, the boy who had grown up before my eyes, was now leaving me cryptic notes and keys, pulling me deeper into this mess I had created. I heard footsteps on the stairs, and I quickly folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. Along with the key, my husband appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of barely contained anger. Who was that? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Just Mrs. Harper, I said quickly, my voice too high-pitched. Why do I feel like I'm hiding something? She found something on her porch and thought it might be ours. It was nothing. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if he could see right through me. Nothing. Huh? He said, his voice dripping with skepticism. Funny how there's always nothing going on when I'm not around. It's not like that, I said, my voice trembling. I'm not hiding anything from you. Aren't you? He shot back, taking a step closer to me, because it seems like every time I turn my back, something happens. First your nephew, now the neighbor. What's next? Are you going to start inviting the whole neighborhood over for a heart-to-heart? That's not fair, I said, my voice rising. You're twisting this into something it's not. I didn't ask for any of this. Didn't you? He said, his voice icy. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who's been letting this happen. You're the one who didn't shut him down when he said those things. You're the one who's been keeping secrets from me. I haven't, I started, but he cut me off with a sharp wave of his hand. I don't want to hear it, he said, his voice cold. I'm done with this. I'm done with you. You figure out how to fix this mess, or I'm walking out that door and not coming back. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Is this how it's going to end? I wanted to say something, to argue, to beg him to stay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, as he turned on his heel and walked away. I heard the bedroom door slam shut, the sound echoing through the empty house. How did it come to this? I thought, sinking down onto the couch, the weight of everything pressed down on me, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The small package felt like a burning coal in my pocket, a reminder of the mess I had created. What am I going to do? I thought, my mind racing. Do I need him? Do I ignore it? Do I tell my husband? But deep down, I knew there was only one answer. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't let it fester. I had to face it, no matter what it cost me. I just didn't know if I was ready for what was coming next. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, each second dragging on like an eternity. I sat there, staring at the wall, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What happens now? And then, as if in answer, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up, my heart pounding as I saw the name on the screen. It was my nephew. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment before I swiped to answer. Hello? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Auntie, he. My nephew's voice trembled on the other end of the line, heavy with a mix of desperation and something else I couldn't quite place. Auntie, he said, the word lingering like a secret waiting to be spilled. Meet me at the old place, and we'll finish what we started. I froze, my grip tightening on the phone. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice hitching despite my effort to keep it steady. My mind raced. The old place, it could only mean one thing, the cabin by the lake where we'd spent summers together when he was just a boy. It had been years since we'd been there, years since I'd even thought about it. But now, the memories came flooding back, unbidden and vivid. He didn't answer right away, and I could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven, as if he were wrestling with something deep inside. You know where, he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. Just, please, Auntie, I need to see you. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. What am I doing? I thought. This is wrong, so wrong. But even as the voice of reason screamed in my head, another part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, felt a strange pull, a curiosity I couldn't ignore. I don't know, I stammered, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter for support. Please, he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made my resolve waver. It wasn't just desperation, it was vulnerability, a raw honesty that cut through the tension between us. I can't do this alone. I need to talk to you. Just one last time. One last time. The words echoed in my mind, heavy with finality. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath as I tried to steady my nerves. Fine, I said finally, the word slipping out before I could stop it. But this is the last time. Do you understand? After this, we never speak of it again. I understand, he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice, tinged with something else, something that made my stomach twist. Thank you, Auntie. I'll see you there. The line went dead, leaving me standing there in the kitchen, the silence pressing in around me like a weight. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, almost midnight. My husband was upstairs, asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface of our seemingly normal lives. I should tell him, I thought, guilt gnawing at the edges of my conscience. I should wake him up and tell him everything, but even as the idea crossed my mind, I dismissed it. No, I thought, this is something I need to handle on my own. I couldn't bear the thought of another confrontation, another argument. Not tonight. Quietly, I grabbed my coat and slipped out the front door, the cool night air hitting me like a splash of cold water. The drive to the cabin was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I navigated the winding roads. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, guilt, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. What am I walking into? I wondered, the question gnawing at me as the trees blurred past the window. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin, my heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The place looked just as I remembered it, old and weathered, with a faint glow of light spilling out from the windows. My nephew's car was parked outside, and I could see his silhouette moving around inside. I sat there for a moment, my hands still on the wheel, trying to summon the courage to step out of the car. You shouldn't be here, I told myself sternly. This is a mistake. But even as the voice of reason tried to pull me back, I found myself opening the door and stepping out into the cool night air. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked up to the front door, each step heavy with uncertainty. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pushing it open. He was standing in the middle of the room, his back to me, his shoulders tense. When he turned around, his eyes met mine, and I could see the storm of emotions in his gaze: fear, longing, and something else I couldn't quite place. "Auntie," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You came." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "I came," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. "But this is the last time. Do you understand? After tonight, we never speak of this again." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I understand," he said, taking a step toward me. "But before that, there's something I need to say." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before he looked back up at me, his eyes filled with a raw honesty that took my breath away. "I love you, Auntie," he said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I've loved you for as long as I can remember, and I know it's wrong. I know it's forbidden, but I can't help it. You're the only person who's ever truly understood me, the only person who's ever made me feel whole." I stared at him, my mind reeling. This is wrong, I thought, the voice of reason screaming in my head. So wrong. But even as I tried to push the thought away, I felt a strange pull, a connection I couldn't deny. "You don't know what you're saying," I said finally, my voice trembling. This isn't love. It's just confusion, just a crush." "It's not a crush," he said, his voice firm now, his gaze unwavering. "I know what I feel, Auntie, and I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I need you. I need you in a way I've never needed anyone else." I took another step back, my heart pounding in my chest. This can't happen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're my nephew. I'm married. This is wrong." He took a step toward me, his eyes filled with a raw intensity that took my breath away. "I know it's wrong," he said softly, "but sometimes, the things that are wrong are the things we need the most." I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "Please," I whispered, "don't do this." But he didn't stop. He took another step toward me, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze. "I'm sorry, Auntie," he said softly, "but I can't keep pretending. I can't keep hiding how I feel." And then, before I could say anything, before I could stop him, he leaned in and kissed me,